You're looking at me through the lens of the Nikon R10 Super 8 camera. The R10 has been my go-to camera for shooting on Super 8 for a few years now, so today I want to talk about the camera in more detail and talk about it and just the different features that it has. The Nikon R10 is awesome, and if you're looking for a Super 8 camera with a bit of heft to it, then this is one I would really recommend. I've been shooting with the R10 for a few years now, and you can see more examples of footage that I've shot with it in the Super 8 shorts that I posted earlier this year on the channel, which were all done with this camera. Nikon released the R10 in 1973, and it easily sets itself aside from a lot of other Super 8 cameras of that era, which were largely cheaply made and had very few controls. With its heavy build quality, variety of buttons and switches on the side, and the very sharp Nikkor lens, it isn't hard to see why this stands out against something like this Yashica Super 8 camera that I have, for example. The Yashica Electro 8 is still a fine camera, and I've shot a little bit of footage with it before, but there's a bit of a jump in quality when I compare it against this, which was shot on the Nikon. Nikon only put out 4 Super 8 cameras in comparison to, say, Canon, who put out around 30 models for the format over the years. Nikon Super Zoom 8 was first in 1966 and followed by the Nikon 8X Super Zoom the following year. These two aren't anything super special and are pretty similar to a lot of early Super 8 cameras, lacking the features that would appear on the later Nikon models. When the R10 was released in 1973, Nikon also put out the R8. The R8 is slightly more compact than the R10, but doesn't have quite the same quality of lens on it. The R8 also requires an additional light meter battery where the R10 does not. The R10 takes 6 AA batteries in the handle, which is a lot, yes, but these power everything on the camera, including the internal exposure system, so you don't need to get any of those mercury cell battery replacements like you need on cameras like the Nitso models. On this side of the camera, we've got our film compartment, which is where our friendly little Super 8 cartridge just drops right in. Beside that is our frame rate control, which gives us the options of 18 frames per second, 24 frames per second, and even 54 frames per second if you want to do high frame rate slow motion stuff. It can also do single frame capture as well for something like animation. The ring around this control is an exposure compensation dial. Rotating this allows you to tell the camera to over or underexpose the film by a little bit. Up here is a battery check light, so we know that our AA's are good, and on top of the camera is the filter slot. This is where you can remove the daylight orange filter inside of the camera if you're shooting tungsten film indoors under tungsten light. This filter is never in place when you're using daylight film, so you don't have to worry about it, but it's normally in place when you use tungsten film in the camera. Putting something into the slot will remove it. Originally, the R10 used a filter key accessory, but I just use a piece of plastic that I keep tied to the camera that works just fine. On the other side of the camera is where the magic happens. The Nikon R10 can do automatic fades, lap dissolves, variable shutter, macro focus, and a little bit of double exposure and reverse filming. This knob is the manual exposure control, but on mine, it's broken. Luckily, my workaround for that is the exposure lock function, which does still work. Inside the viewfinder, the aperture values are displayed on the top, and I can see what's selected when the camera is automatically exposing. Pulling the knob out allows me to lock the exposure on a certain f-stop to prevent it from constantly changing when I don't want it to. The R10 has a very solid exposure system when automatically exposing the film that you put into it. It's able to expose for film stocks between 10 and 650 ISO, which is awesome even though there aren't that many different options available for Super 8 film currently. But I can trust that the camera will handle all of the currently available stocks, which include 50, 100, 160, 200, and 500 ISO options. This camera is great for the higher ISO stocks like 500T, whereas a lot of Super 8 cameras that were made were only designed for use with low ISO stocks closer to the 50 ISO that's available now. I've shot quite a few rolls through my R10 and always had great results no matter the film stock. 50 ISO comes out looking great in the bright sunlight and into the golden hours of the summer evening. 200 and 500T have very nice flexible results when working indoors with even basic cheap video lights, and they can be color corrected later for best results under new lights that aren't fully tungsten balanced. Ektachrome 100 is such a fun film to shoot, albeit the most expensive stock that Kodak offers. It has really nice saturation and contrast, but also a bit of a limited exposure range sometimes. It's great to use in a higher end camera like the R10, so I know it will come out looking great because it's expensive every time I want to shoot it. And Tri-X is such a cool, classic black and white film in Super 8. chunky grain but great contrast, and another one that you want to have a reliable exposure for. Shooting with the R10 is great, but can take some getting used to because of the different buttons on the side, but also because it's a heavier camera. It's great on a tripod for sure, and going handheld isn't necessarily a problem, though it might be hard to keep it perfectly steady. The viewfinder though is one of the brightest I've seen on a Super 8 camera ever. And it's also way easier to focus with in comparison to a lot of Super 8 cameras that are out there. The Nikon R10 has split image focusing, which is similar to what you might see in like a 35mm SLR. It can still be difficult to nail it perfectly, but many other Super 8 cameras are very difficult to focus with and lack much in the way of a focus aid. The R10 isn't the only camera out there with split image focusing for Super 8, but it's not the most common feature. The best advice I can give for focusing on Super 8 cameras is to first zoom all the way in, and that's where it will be easiest to see the focus actually change in the viewfinder. Then zoom back out to the framing you want and shoot. Most Super 8 cameras have a parfocal lens, which means that the focus stays the same when you zoom in or out. In the viewfinder, the R10 displays the aperture of the lens on the top, and on the side is the shutter indicator, which means you can reduce the amount of light entering the camera for different effects, or if you were shooting a high ISO film outside on a sunny day, and wanted to avoid some overexposure. The window is clear when the shutter is open all the way, and then when you close it, it fills up with a red indicator. It will go from a 160-degree shutter angle to 80, then to 40, and then completely closed. You can use this to do manual fade-ins or outs, or you can use the built-in auto function on the Nikon for these effects. This side of the camera has a lot going on, but using the manual, which is easily found online, it becomes easier to navigate. We have a switch that can be pushed up for fading out and down for fading in, or forward for controlling overlay or double exposure effects. And that's used along with this other switch for choosing between those overlay and double exposure options. Then there's also a rewind and forward switch which controls the direction of the film motor. Let's start with a basic fade in. You can do a manual fade by turning the shutter knob and opening the shutter yourself, or start with the shutter closed, and while filming I can just push down the FI switch and it will automatically fade in. The same works for fading out. Shoot normally and then press the FO switch and the camera automatically closes the shutter while you're shooting. To do an overlap shot, also called a crossfade or lap dissolve, I can just switch this to OL and then begin to shoot while pressing this switch forward. My shot will fade out and the camera will stop. Then I set it to rewind and hold down the trigger, which will rewind the film automatically while the shutter is closed. This puts the film back to the frame where the fade out on the first shot began. Now I can shoot while doing a fade in, and this creates a lap dissolve between the two shots. The Nikon can do a little bit of rewinding like that, which many Super 8 cameras can't do because of the design of a Super 8 cartridge. Rewinding is very limited usually because it can break the spindle inside of the cartridge itself. The Nikon has the ability to only rewind about 100 frames of the film. This does mean you can do a little bit of reverse shooting, which can be fun. I cover the lens or close the shutter up and then shoot while pressing the switch forward until the camera stops. I can then set this to rewind, open up the shutter, and shoot about 5 or 6 seconds in reverse. Then I just have to make sure to close the shutter again, set the camera to forward, and then advance past the section that I just shot in reverse so I don't double expose it. But using that control, I can also do short amounts of double exposure. For example, here I just covered half the frame with my hand, rewound the film, and then shot another scene the same way, and this makes a double exposed shot. And finally, we have macro focusing ability, which can be done by sliding the ring of the zoom lens forward to switch into macro mode. I only had a few seconds left on the cartridge to shoot this flower, but this is how macro looks on the R10. The camera also has 2 speeds for zooming in and out, which you select using the switch on the handle. F is a faster zoom, and then S is a slower one. The R10 and most Super 8 cameras aren't sync sound cameras, so normally as you're running the motor it kind of fluctuates in terms of the speed. It's not staying at a locked in frame rate. I've achieved sync sound on this footage just like we achieved it on our Super 8 shorts from a few weeks ago on the channel by adjusting and tweaking the speed of things a little bit during the editing of the digital scan.
Super 8 and sound don't go great together though, because these cameras are all pretty noisy, and especially in small spaces you notice that a lot. Even outside where I'm a few feet away from the camera, I've covered it in towels to dampen the motor noise, and you can even still hear it a little. This Nikon though also has a port for a tape recorder accessory. Years ago, there existed a reel-to-reel tape recorder made by the Super 8 sound company that was compatible with this camera through a special port. It would record onto Super 8 magnetic stock, which was magnetic audio tape that looked just like Super 8 film. All of that stuff is super hard to find now, except that I happen to have like a lot of Super 8 mag stock and nothing to do with it. So if you have one of those Super 8 sound recorders, God, please let me know. All these little effects and controls aren't integral to a good Super 8 camera. It definitely adds to the bulk of this thing, which might be off-putting to some, but it is very fun to have these options when shooting. There are lots of great Super 8 cameras out there from names like Canon, Nikkon, and Beaulieu that share some of the functions of the R10, but so far the R10 is my personal favorite for using. It's not a cheap camera by any means either, and that is something that a lot of people will probably want to take into consideration if they're looking at Super 8 cameras. Maybe not the best choice for your first Super 8 camera, but a really solid one nonetheless.
The variety of features and functions on the Nikon make it a really nice camera, combined with the fact that it has a very, very nice lens on it. Nikon didn't make a lot of these cameras for this format, but the ones that they did make are pretty solid, especially the R10 that I'm using here. So while it's not necessarily like the small, compact kind of Super 8 camera you want to carry around with you all the time, for throwing on a tripod, for doing on larger projects, and for the variety of different things that it can offer, it's definitely a really nice camera. Thanks so much for checking this out. All the film that you're watching right now has been processed and scanned by Niagara Custom Lab here in Toronto. You can also find links in the description down below of this video for ways to support the channel through merch that I have available and the Patreon that I run to support this stuff. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.
Before I go, I just want to show off a little bit of fun mail that showed up in the P.O. box the other day from Tucker. This is a sealed cartridge of 126 black and white film that's branded as Canapan. I've never seen this branding before and I love it so much, mostly because I'm Canadian, but a lot of old film branding is really fun. It expired in October of 1972 and it's still sealed. Even though it's Canapan, the packaging inside says made in England. I have no plans to shoot this one, I think, because of how expired it is, and I really do like the packaging. Tucker also included a note that looks like it came straight from a typewriter, which says, "Hi Noah, I wanted to send you this interesting piece of film in Canadian history. I know nothing about 126 film or Canapan as a brand, but I found it in a thrift store box containing an old Kodak Duoflex 4 and thought of your P.O. box as the perfect way for it to go. Enjoy, Tucker." I made a video on 126 film years ago, and it was single-use cartridges that had basically 35mm film inside of it, but they were meant to be really easy to load for people to just take pictures with. You can get cartridges from places like the Film Photography Project if you want to roll your own 126 film today for those cameras. Thank you so much, Tucker. The Canapan is such a cute little artifact from the past. And just an extra special shout out to some of the people over on the Patreon who go above and beyond with the support: Babak Motamedi, Taylor Brown, Carson Feller, Larry O, Bernhard, and Tony Graham.